Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're diving deep into the text of Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre to systematically deconstruct a massive literary myth. You know the one. For generations, we've all been completely captivated by the character of Edward Fairfax Rochester. We picture this brooding, romantic hero, right? A tragic figure tortured by a past he just couldn't escape. But today, we're going to look really closely at the evidence and read his story against the grain. Okay, let's jump right in by addressing this widely accepted romantic narrative. Rochester constantly plays the card of the helpless victim, caught up in a past he couldn't control. But if you really listen to his own account, there's a huge glaring problem. He's always the one who suffers. He never takes agency. Everything is done to him. His father tricked him. His wife deceived him. It's like he wants us to believe his fate is just overwhelmingly cruel, like a leaf blowing helplessly in the wind. And that brings us to our main focus for today. On one side, we have the myth we've all been sold, but on the other, the reality the text actually supports. When you strip away the romance and look at the basic, cold facts of his life, that whole tragic victim narrative completely falls apart. Instead, what actually emerges is the profile of a highly calculating conman and a habitual liar. So we're going to break this down exhibit by exhibit. Let's kick things off with Exhibit A, his marriage to Bertha Mason. This is literally the foundation of his entire victim complex. Rochester claims his father sent him to Jamaica, totally innocent, completely ignorant. He says his dad knew Bertha's family was wealthy, but maliciously hid the fact that madness ran in their bloodline. He essentially wants us to believe he walked into this trap completely blind. Now, what's really fascinating here is Rochester's totally backwards logic. He says her family wished to secure him. Wait, let's pause and think about the basic economics of the 19th century for a second. Rochester was a second son. He had absolutely zero inheritance. His only real asset was a good family name. Does it make any sense at all that a wildly wealthy family would need to secure a completely penniless young man? Right, because the negotiation usually goes the exact opposite way. In the marriage market of that era, a handsome, well-born young guy with absolutely zero money of his own was prime real estate to actively go out and seek a wealthy heiress. It's highly, highly improbable, honestly practically impossible, that a man in Rochester's desperate financial spot wouldn't be acutely aware of the massive financial benefits of tying the knot with Bertha. I mean, just look at this staggering number. Bertha Mason was the daughter of a rich plantation owner, and she came with a dowry of 30,000 pounds. That is an absolutely enormous sum of money back then, and it's a number that Bronte mentions repeatedly throughout the novel. This gave Rochester a very clear, undeniable motive. Is it really plausible that a broke guy in his position never once asked about the money? No way. Plus, he claims absolute ignorance about the woman he was marrying. Yet 19th century marriage certificates meticulously recorded ages. Bertha was actually 5 years older than him. So we have to ask ourselves, was he completely blind? Did he literally just not look at the legal documents he was signing? Or, was he simply willing to ignore all the fine print because he wanted his hands on that 30,000 pounds? Okay, let's move on to Exhibit B and see how this builds into something much, much darker. Rochester marries Bertha, he gets the money he desperately needed, and then he discovers she's mentally ill. His solution? He decides to literally lock her in an attic, leave the country, and kick off a horrifying campaign of silencing and slandering his legally wedded wife. He just unleashes this brutal indictment of Bertha's character. He claims her nature was totally alien to his, that her tastes were obnoxious, her mind common and low. But hey, we really need to remember a vital piece of context here. We only ever get to hear Rochester's version of the story. For 15 agonizing years, Bertha is locked in a tiny room on the 3rd floor of Thornfield Hall. Really think about that number for a second. 15 years. During that entire time, she has no lawyer. She has no therapist. She has no priest. She has absolutely zero voice to defend herself against the horrific things her husband is saying about her. What we're witnessing here is a textbook, classic example of narrative violence. That's when someone uses their words to systematically erase another person's humanity just to justify their abuse. Rochester uses his absolute control over the narrative to deliberately reshape Bertha's identity. He desperately needs her to be a monster in the eyes of Jane and in the eyes of us, the readers. Because think about it, if she's a monster, then he's entirely justified in keeping her locked in a cage. And wow, this forces us to pause and ask a truly terrifying question, one that the novel itself completely refuses to ask.
What if she wasn't a monster to begin with? What if she was a relatively normal woman who was driven completely insane by a decade and a half of solitary confinement? When you look at the cold, hard facts objectively, his treatment of her is the exact kind of thing that would utterly destroy a person's mind. So, leaving his imprisoned, voiceless wife behind with a caretaker, Rochester jets off across Europe, which brings us to Exhibit C, his supposed ultra-romantic search for true love. He frames his years of wandering as this tragic journey of a lonely, broken soul just looking for a genuine connection.
He attempts to excuse his string of affairs with this incredibly flowery romantic fantasy. He claims he was simply seeking the ideal woman across the continent, but tragically, he just never found her. Honestly, it sounds beautiful, right? Until you actually map out what he was doing.
Just take a look at this timeline of his conquests. He moves from English ladies to French countesses, then German aristocrats, all the way to Italian signoras. When you lay it out geographically like this, it hits you. This wasn't a search for love. This was a repetitive, carefully calculated predatory pattern. He was literally moving from country to country, demographic to demographic, engaging in the exact same behavior over and over again. Let's translate his little romantic fantasy into harsh reality. Rochester was a wealthy, legally married Englishman traveling abroad. He actively lied about his marital status to seduce women, and then just discarded them the absolute second he got bored. I mean, he even had an illegitimate child with a French opera singer, and then utterly refused to raise her. Let's be real, does that sound like a tragic victim seeking a soulmate to you? Absolutely not.
Which brings us to our closing argument, and the real reason he returns to Thornfield to court his young employee. If Rochester was really seeking a wife in Europe, why didn't he just illegally marry one of those countesses or aristocrats? Well, because if he tried, their powerful, wealthy families would have investigated him, discovered the dark truth about Bertha, and utterly destroyed his reputation. And that explains exactly why he chose Jane Eyre. She was orphaned with no family. She had zero financial resources. She lacked any social connections. And most importantly, she had absolutely no powerful fathers or brothers to expose him or avenge her honor if things went south. He preyed on Jane because she was incredibly safe and completely vulnerable. She totally lacked the social safety net that could hold a con man accountable. So that victim narrative we've all been sold, and let's face it, that we often fall for in romantic fiction, is a total lie. It is so easy to be swept away by the brooding bad boy, but Rochester is not some helpless leaf blowing in the wind of cruel fate. He wanted the Mason money, he got it, he silenced his wife to keep it, and he calculated his risks perfectly to secure his own pleasure at the expense of vulnerable women. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a really provocative thought to chew on for our next analysis. If Rochester successfully built his entire life on erasing his first wife, how will he use those exact same techniques of manipulation and isolation to trap Jane? How does the entire plot of this beloved classic actually rest on the terrifying, impossible secret of a madwoman hidden in plain sight? Think about that the next time you crack open the book. Thanks so much for joining me, and I'll see you in the next explainer.